Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is Nikos RPG, and we are with the Game Master's Guide today going to be talking about dice. Now, I am casual today. I'm not really trying to be particularly enthusiastic, but man, dice can be such a challenge, especially when you're talking about players that just haven't understood the mechanics and the dynamics of role-playing and are just getting started. So we're going to be talking about some of the do's and don'ts that should happen at the table concerning die rolling, some of the incidents and accidents that occur because of the ways that people roll dice, and even some information about the mechanisms of proper dice rolling. Not to be the wet blanket to be dynamic, but I think you'll see what I'm talking about. Before we get to that, though, make sure that you go down below and press all the buttons so that the algorithm will know that you're part of our audience. And so let's get started, shall we?
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Okay, so when we're talking about die rolling in any game, it doesn't have to be a role-play game per se, but the idea of role-playing of dice rolling in role-playing games is that the dice are used to create a random number generation before whatever span the game master directs. And generally on a 20-sided dice, it's a single nice dice number that appears on the top of the die roll. And sometimes that can be a little bit confusing, and there are a bunch of different dynamics that we want to go into in particular. But the first one I want to talk about is, let me see, where did my title go? No, that's not even the right one. So therefore we just must have skipped this page. Ha. All right. So one of the biggest challenges is that dice as a mechanic work best when they are flat on a table surface so that the top can be read. In the case of the four-sided, sometimes you're reading the diagonal faces. Sometimes you're reading the bottom number. It all depends on the dice. But generally speaking, when you roll the dice, it is best to leave them on the table so that they can be observed or read by other people. Now, this is somewhat problematic when you're talking about a role-playing group where they're sitting around the table and they each have their own set of dice. It sometimes seems that you shouldn't have to police the dice rolls. But the challenge with die rolling in any case is that the number being generated really needs to be for the director known. And here's what I mean when I say picking up the dice to read them is if I've rolled the dice across the table and then instead of leaving it there for anybody to look down at the dice and see it, I pick the dice up, move it so that I can make it readable to myself, and then I put it back down. Or even don't even put it back down, I just simply read the number off the face. The challenge is that the dice, if it's not still flat on the surface, may be canted, may be twisted, and therefore the validation of the die roll really depends on where it is. I'm going to give an example on my table down here below so you can kind of see. Oh, that's a mess down there, so we won't deal with that. But I was working on something a bit over my hands, so I probably aren't even clean. But the idea is that you roll the dice across the table. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I just won't do it. But I roll the dice and I call out what I see. My hands are up here. I'm not touching the dice. It's a 20. So that's legit. That players can see and observe and look at the number as it is. But if I roll the number and then I pick it up and I say it's a 20, what they might be seeing is a 14 and a 20 at a canted angle. So was it rolled a 14 or was it rolled a 20? You really have to be particular about it because the die roll is the random number generation being used by the game master. And so if that number is being altered, adjusted, changed, modified for good or for ill, it messes with the dynamics of the system that the game master has put into place, so to speak, for that particular die roll. So picking up the dice after you roll them is not the way to go. Simply leave the dice on the table so that if somebody else wishes to observe them, or if the game master requires a verification, so the dice can be read to make sure that the dice number is what you say it is. And I know that the issue becomes one of trust, but I cannot tell you the number of times that I've had one or two or even all of my players roll 15 or better more than 20 times in a row. And while I know statistically that's possible, it's just not likely. And so leaving the table dice on the table to be read makes it a lot easier. Now I'm belaboring the point, so let me move on. This one's a fun one. I have especially younger players really appreciate the way the dice feel in their hands, and they'll sit and they'll shake and they'll shake and they'll shake, getting ready to roll. They're really psyching themselves up. And so I asked them, I said, are you ever going to go ahead and shake roll the dice? And they go, dice. I said, yeah, you're shaking the H out of them. So they become dice. The idea is it should be generally one or two or three good shakes and a release on the tabletop so it'll roll. I don't know how difficult that can be, but I do know that the kids love to get excited and really shake them around and move them around. It isn't until it hits the table that it matters anyway. But it's not like I said, these are not problems or challenges. They're just my personal peccadillos. It's like, let's do this, all right? Now the next one is I'm sitting at a table that's about 3 feet wide, and it's about 8 feet long. So if I'm a person that appreciates the long roll, I like to watch the dice roll for a long time. I should roll perpendicular to the way I'm seated instead of rolling across the short table with that hard roll where it can bounce off the edge of the table and go off into the hinterlands. I should roll the long way so that it gets all that travel out of its way. The alternate, of course, would be to have some kind of a backstop, but it is just a challenge when every week, the person is rolling the dice and they go rolling off the table. And then they go pick them up and they bring them back and they go right back to the same position and roll again and roll off the table. It's like, it was funny the first time, the fifth time, not so much. So make sure if you're going to use a long rolling mechanism that you align yourself appropriately to keep the dice on the table for as long as you can, so that we don't have to chase them every single die roll. And this one's, I don't mean to point it to anybody in particular, but I have some friends that collect the very ornate, you've seen them, the ones that are like wrought iron, little tiny wrought gold and silver, and the letters are formed out of the sides of the shape, and they're nigh illegible. You can barely read them if you're actually looking at them directly head on, but you certainly can't read them at a distance, and you certainly can't read them unless you're directly above them. And therefore the ornamental dice, although they're beautiful, are really fundamentally pieces of art, and so their use in regular everyday role-playing can be problematic, particularly, again, if the game master has to ask you to read them, because what do you have to do with a really ornate dice? You have to pick it up. So we're going back to step one again here. So try to although this may be a case where your favorite dice are the really ornamental ones, in which case roll them in a wide open space so that everybody else can take a look at them if they want. That's the easiest way to resolve it. Once they become understood that we can actually read them, even at a recent distance, then perhaps there could be more freedom on this. But really, the really ornamental dice are really problematic for most game masters to be able to deal with what you're rolling. And this one's a peccadillo that's not mine, but was brought to my attention by another player. And I had never seen anybody get that frustrated before. But if you are at a table and everybody has their own dice, reaching across and grabbing someone else's dice without their permission to roll them, it can be, granted, there's some of it's just pure superstition. Sometimes it's just happenstance, but grabbing other people's dice without permission is a no-no. It really should be, by etiquette, requesting permission. May I see your dice, or may I look at your dice, and may I even roll your dice? These are all just being polite about the dice mechanics. And most games have a dice mechanism that requires to roll various sizes of dice at different times, and just grabbing somebody's dice arbitrarily is just it's bad. It's sort of dirty pool. It's not a good thing to do. You should try to endeavor to ask permission should you have to require somebody else's dice. This is a peccadillo of mine, and it has everything to do with a role-playing mechanism that's based on a specific die roll that's going to be required time and time again. So players who sit there and fiddle with their dice and are constantly, rolling them over and over again, when they get to a good number, they might stop, and then they'll wait, and then when I call for a die roll, then they go, I've got a 16. It's like, wait, how can you have an answer so fast? I just now called for the roll. And it's, well, I just rolled it a minute ago. The rolling before the fact has the problem of appearing as if you are front-loading or staging the die roll. That is to say, you're rolling until you get a number that you're going to want to keep, and therefore adjusting the random number generator mechanism that the game master is calling for intentionally and specifically, so that you hedge the dice mechanism that the game master is asking for. Generally, the kind of rule is hands off the dice until you're rolling for the mechanism, unless you're doing something else. For example, if a character is rolling up another character sheet at the same time or whatever, then the idea of dice rolling isn't such a problem, but that's divorced from the actual requisites for die rolling in the game. Preferably don't roll in advance, but only when the game master requests for a die roll, because that way it's not that they're changing the luck in the dice. They're simply changing the process by which the data is collected, and requesting die rolls is kind of the purvey of the game master, and that's what they're there to do. Another of the mechanistic problematic die rolling peccadillos that I have is a person will use a die that is not high contrast. For example, this is high contrast. It's white on a darker color. And if it was, say, a pale pinkish against this, it would be lower contrast. Very less difference between the two colors. And I can't tell you, again, how many times I've seen this mechanism where a person... the GM says, go ahead and roll. It's a 15 or better. They'll roll the dice, and before you have time to breathe, they've picked it up and they go, 15. Well, you can say 15. In this case, I actually rolled a 1. But the point is that I can't see the dice from across the table, and the quick pickup is really the problem. If you're going to use a low contrast dice, expect the game master or other players to want to see what the dice roll was. The roll and the quick pick has everything to do with the player having some arguably irrational desire to never be wrong or to never fail. The idea is that if you roll it and you get the number that is less than accepted, you're somehow a failure, and that's not true. It's the dice are there for the specifics of determining what the die roll was compared to the threshold, and just it's bad optics. It's a matter of making your role playing style look a little shifty if you're always rolling dice and immediately grabbing it with a fast pickup and calling out the number rather than leaving the dice where they rolled so that others can verify. So now, all of these challenges with die rolling really comes down to the fact that the game is called role playing with an E. Role playing, not role playing. If you're going to play a game where the dependents are on the dice, then certainly you should have a dice tray. You should have everybody looking at the dice, and that should be the major focus. The concept of giving the opportunity for the others to read your dice after you've rolled them is merely a matter of protecting yourself from the perception that you're doing something wrong. It doesn't mean that you were or ever did, but it provides a bad image, and these rolling peccadillos really have to do with what's going to slow the game down and take the RNG generating portion of the game and making it the focus, not the dialogue, narrative, and descriptions of the role play aspect of the game. Now, I know there are going to be a lot of you that have a different opinion, and I'd love to hear what are some of your dice rolling peccadillos. What kind of issues do you have with the way people roll their dice? Or perhaps you have a counter to one of the positions I've represented, and if so, I'd be glad to hear it. I'd like to have a great conversation about dice. They are important. There's nothing like having a good set of polys in your hand because they do a lot for the game. But it's a matter of the ethics of being a good player and maintaining good role playing etiquette during your game session to make it the best game session it can be. All right, we'll be with you again next time tonight at 11 p.m. I'm Jonathan Albin, Nikos RPG Game Master's Guide, and this has been Dice Rolling Peccadillos and Protocols.